I told the officers what I had seen and what I had done. I led them to the gun. They told me there had been a robbery nearby. The victim had been shot in the head. They said the running man sounded like the guy they were looking for. I spent the next 4 hours in the detective bureau. I was interviewed and re-interviewed by detectives, one in particular who was gruff and had a no-nonsense air about him. He told me that the victim might not make it, that I might end up being the only witness. Because of my description of the running man, several men with long hair, beards, and printed T-shirts were pulled out of the Parrot and taken to the police department to stand in suspect lineups. I was the one looking through the one-way glass at them. I was the only witness. I had to pick the shooter. There was only one problem. They didn't have the guy. It had been dark out, but the street was lighted. I clearly saw the man who stashed the gun and knew they didn't have him. Sometime between when I saw him duck into the Parrot and when the police came to round up patrons fitting my description, the shooter had slipped away. This did not sit well with the detectives. They believed they had the guy. They believed that I was simply too scared or intimidated to make the ID. I could not convince them, and after going back and forth with the gruff detective for what seemed like hours, it ended badly. My father demanded my release, and I left the department with that detective thinking I had been too afraid to step up. I knew he was wrong, but it didn't make me feel any better. Although I had been honest, I knew I had let him down. I started reading the newspaper after that night, religiously. At first it was to look for stories about the shooting. The victim survived, but I never heard from the detectives again, and I wondered what had happened to the case. Was the shooter ever identified? Was he ever caught? I also became fascinated with the crime stories and the detectives working the cases. South Florida was a strange place. A torrent of drug money was flooding the coast. Fast boats and cars. Smugglers were moving into the best neighborhoods. Crimes of violence happened everywhere at any time. There seemed to always be a lot of crime stories to read. I got hooked. Soon I was reading true crime books and then crime novels. In the years that followed, I discovered the work of Joseph Wambaugh and Raymond Chandler, and eventually I decided I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to work for a newspaper on the crime beat. I wanted to watch and learn about the detectives and then one day write about them in novels. All because of a moment. All because I had looked out my window. Many years later, I returned to the detective bureau where I had spent those hours and disappointed those detectives. When I returned, it was as a reporter. I was on the police beat and I would visit the bureau almost daily. My assignment was to chronicle the crimes of the city. The gruff detective was still there. The years in between had sanded down his edges a little bit. At first I ignored him and he didn't remember me. Eventually, though, I told him who I was, reminded him of that night, and once more made my case. That they didn't have the shooter. That the running man had gotten away. He still didn't believe me. He still believed I had been afraid that night to step up. Over the course of a few years, I was often in that detective bureau, but I never won the detective over. It pained me but didn't deter me. In fact, it was in that detective bureau that the next important moment occurred. It was a small thing, but perhaps the single most important thing I ever saw as a crime writer, and it is recounted here in the first story of this collection. After numerous requests and lengthy negotiations that went all the way up to the chief of police, I was granted complete access to the homicide squad for 1 week. Full access. I was given a pager, and if the homicide squad got called out, then so would I. My assignment was to write about life and homicide, to get the inside look. The irony of crime beat journalism, maybe all of journalism, is that the best stories are really the worst stories. The stories of calamity and tragedy are the stories that journalists live for. It gets the adrenaline churning in their blood and can burn them out young, but nevertheless it is a hard fact of the business. Their best day is your worst day. This held true for my week with the homicide squad. It turned into a great story for me, but not for the 3 people who were murdered during the course of time I was riding with the squad. The single moment that influenced my writing more than any other came at the end of the week, in the last hour of my week-long stay with the squad. I sat in the squad supervisor's office, going over the last-minute details and questions before I would turn my pager in and go back to the newspaper to write the story. Sergeant George Hurt was tired. He and his detectives had chased 3 murders in 5 days. Sitting at his desk, he took off his glasses to rub his eyes. When he dropped the glasses on his desk, I noticed that the earpiece had a deep groove cut into it. It was like spying a diamond in the sand, for I knew exactly how that groove had gotten there. During the week that I had watched the detectives at work, I had seen Sergeant Hurt take off his glasses on numerous occasions. Invariably, he hooked the earpiece in his mouth so his hands were free. At 3 different murder scenes, I had seen him approach the victim's body and take his glasses off, always hooking them in his mouth. These were solemn moments. He was observing the victim as a detective, but there seemed to be something else going on as well, a sort of communion or secret promise. It was not something he would talk to me about when I asked. But now I saw the earpiece and I knew something. I knew that when he hooked his glasses in his mouth,